The emergent stage is what Baer et al. Consider to be that first stage of reading development. It's consistent, and the characteristics they talk about are consistent with Schall's pseudo reading, her stage 0, with logographic reading, with pre-alphabetic reading. And although, as we looked at last week, it all begins under the crook of an arm and the comfort of a loved one's lap, there is so much that kids are learning besides just that good feeling of being, which is not unimportant certainly, but that good feeling of being read to by someone that you love and that you know loves you. What's going on, most broadly speaking, is when kids learn to read, when we all learn to read, we're really making this match between speech, if we're hearing people, between speech and print. Now that can be at a very broad level. Here it's talking about the discourse level, so they're talking about paragraphs, they're talking about multiple sentences, they're talking about making meaning. But if you flip that a little bit, the notion that print is language written down is something that kids have to learn. I typically assign a book called Other People's Words by Victoria Purcell Gates. And it's a story about Donnie, who we are introduced to as a first grader, and his mother, Jenny, who is determined that unlike herself and her husband, Donnie will learn to read. Both Jenny and Big Donnie, the father, are virtually non-literate. They really do not read. And Donnie then comes to school without this sense that print is language written down. And in fact, Jenny comes to her own work in literacy, not really understanding that her speech could be transcribed into print. So at a very, very basic level, what kids are doing is they're learning that speech or language can be written, and that when you do so, it doesn't change. It's invariant. It 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 stays constant, and that it does communicate a message. There is a purpose for it. At the sentence and phrase level, what we're talking about here is primarily, prosody, expression, intonation, the use of punctuation, the use of long sentences or short sentences in order to make a point. And what we usually think about in terms of reading and writing instruction occurs at the word level, that words are embedded within sentences. And we'll come back to this a little bit, but it doesn't hurt to introduce it now. The idea that our speech stream is continuous. We don't pause between words. We often don't even pause between sentences. And so that's why the alphabet Elemento P, Elemento is one letter to a lot of kids, in the same way that words will go together, and it's very difficult for them to pull them apart. It doesn't happen in language, doesn't happen in oral language. And then more fine grain is the idea that we have to map phonemes to graphemes, and that phonemes are those small units of sound within individual words. And we'll talk a lot more about that today. So what does emergent reading look like? Well, up until the last couple of years, I spent every fall in the kindergarten class here on campus with my undergraduate students. And this is what we were watching those kindergartners do. They knew a few letters of the alphabet. Some of them knew and could clap out syllables. Some of them could generate rhymes. Some of them could identify rhymes. Very few of them had the notion of phoneme segmentation. Many could identify their name. Some could write their name. Some had concepts of print. In other words, they knew where a book began and where it ended. Many of them had a hard time finger pointing to individual words. And that's an important benchmark between emergent reading and the next stage, letter name alphabetic reading. They could read a few signs, as I said, their own name, and they kind of knew how a story would go. But there was, as always, a wide range of accomplishments in that kindergarten class. Their writing resembled this somewhat. Some kids, and I've been working in a first grade classroom in the fall for the last 2 years, some of the writing is still almost scribble-like. Some is pictures. Some is letter-like with a picture, so providing script for the picture. Some is left to right and begins to look like letters. Some is indeed letters, but mixed with numbers, and some of that emergent writing is partially phonetic, representing the initial consonant sound and the salient consonant sounds in a word. In general, emergent writing and reading is a continuum. So it's not like a step on the stairs where you're here and then you're somewhere else. No, you're moving your way through this emergent stage from holding writing pencil, like utensils, a pencil or a marker or a crayon, to making letter-like forms, to finally representing speech sounds in print. And again, this is from your textbook. These are but some of the characteristics of emergent spellers. And you can see once upon a time, again, that stream of speech. So there's not this sort of concept of word. There's not spaces between the words. There's not a demarcation of where one word ends and another word begins. Representation of those salient initial consonants, the and fair. The people saw him eat, the beginning to represent sounds, in this case, the sound of the letter name of E. And nobody saw him again, salient consonant sounds, and the end. So what do we do? How do we help children move through this emergent literacy stage? And they suggest 6 components: oral language, phonological awareness, alphabet knowledge, letter sound knowledge, concepts about print, and concepts of words in text, cow or cow T. And it was that cow T that we didn't see in this particular writing sample. So what are some of the things to do? Well, I can't emphasize enough the importance of oral language and vocabulary instruction. Focusing on letter names and focusing on phonics skills all the way through word study is very important. But if we don't focus on vocabulary instruction from the very beginning and support it with oral language, and through oral language, kids will get to 3rd grade or 4th grade and they'll have what has been known for many years, the 4th grade slump. They won't have the vocabulary to understand the more complex texts which they're being required to read. And we're doing some work at Hamilton High School, and vocabulary instruction. Vocabulary is really what is holding these kids back. Books like Corduroy are not books that kids can read themselves, of course, when they're 1st graders. You would never expect that. But those are the books that must be read to children and then vocabulary pulled out and explicitly taught. And vocabulary, of course, this idea of pets and wild animals and domestic animals, all kinds of language is just so important in this emergent stage. The second component is phonological awareness. And I am certain all of you have heard of this. I'm going to sort of review it a little bit. Again, I can't emphasize enough how important this is and the really critical role it plays for children in special programs and children who are the most struggling readers. So Elmo says, walk like a duck. Elmo says, drive a truck, I think. This little pig went to market, this little pig stayed home, etc., etc. And hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle. Examples of ways to begin to promote and introduce young children to phonological awareness. So what is it? Well, we know that infants are born with it. Babies, perhaps even before they're born, are sensitive to the structure of the language they're hearing, and they show a preference for the language that they're hearing. So they're paying attention to the sounds of the language in which they are immersed. And toddlers play with it, just like those nursery rhymes, just like the Dr. Seuss books. They're playing around with alliteration and the sounds of the language. It's phonology. So what is it? Well, it's a sensitivity to the sounds. It's an ability to pay attention to and identify and reflect upon them. It's the sounds of the language, a specific kind of sound, a specific kind of auditory discrimination, if you will. And if phonemic awareness is so important, what is it? Well, we probably need to ask what is a phoneme and be clear that a phoneme is the smallest distinctive unit of speech. It's not the smallest unit of speech, but is the smallest distinctive unit of speech that distinguishes one word from another. And I actually like that better. I assigned the Yap and Yap because I think it has some nice activities in it, but they would say it's the smallest unit of speech that makes a difference in communication. So the difference between bat and cat is one phoneme. It's the difference between ba and ka. And that's what we have to understand. That's a phoneme. Now, phonemic awareness is a conscious metalinguistic awareness of the phonemes, of the sounds of those individual distinctive units of speech in the language. And that is not something that comes naturally. They have to be able to think about those sounds, children, beginning readers, and manipulate those sounds. It's the more fine-grained awareness subsumed, which is under phonological awareness. So phonological awareness is the broad category, talking about rhyming, alliteration, syllables in words. And phonemic awareness, though, is much more unique and harder to acquire, and that's an awareness, a conscious awareness of the individual sounds of the language. Why is that important? Well, it just makes sense, logically, that if we have an alphabetic system where the letters, the print, the graphemes represent the phonemes, you've got to be able to be aware of those individual phonemes in order to make that connection. So it's logically makes sense. And being able to do so, being able to match the alphabet and individual sounds is called the alphabetic principle. And in order to really master our English writing system, you have to be able to take advantage of the alphabetic principle. Important concept. So it's logically consistent. It has sort of constructability. Has it been borne out empirically? Yes, ad nauseum. Over and over and over again, studies have shown that phonemic awareness is one of the best predictors of early reading success, and that when you look at what they, in this particular example, struggling readers and competent readers, struggling readers have poorer phonemic awareness than do competent readers. That in and of itself is compelling, but when you link that with the fact that kids who have never even learned how to read, so kids in kindergarten, measures of phonemic awareness in nursery school or kindergarten of non-readers is a very good predictor of reading, particularly in first or second grade. We also know that kids who have difficulty with phonemic awareness have difficulty learning how to read. I mean, that's part of what these studies have shown, and these are certainly not an exhaustive list. There are hundreds of studies in multiple countries with alphabetic languages. And it has led the International Dyslexia Association to define dyslexia as neurological in origin, difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition and poor spelling, which are the result of a deficit in the phonological component of language. And this phonological deficit is considered the core deficit hypothesis for dyslexia. So why do children, really all children, not children who eventually may be considered to have very severe reading problems, have difficulty recognizing individual speech sounds? Well, that's because, as I sort of mentioned earlier in this video, speech is a continuous stream of sound. And those phonemes are co-articulated. So we run our words together, we run our phonemes together, and so why would you pay attention to it? You don't really need phonemic awareness to speak. It just comes naturally to you that you put these sounds together in the words. You only need phonemic awareness if you're going to try and map those phonemes onto print. What children naturally do, and the Yop article alludes to this as well, although I kind of like this example better, is that if you ask children which word is longer, caterpillar or snake, they will say snake, because they immediately go to what it is referring to. They go to the meaning, and that's the default, is meaning, not sound. And so we have to help children really focus on that sound as something to study in and of itself, to be aware of, recognizing the individual sounds, those phonemes, as separate segments, or else they cannot map them onto the letters that represent them. So how does this develop over time? Well, in kindergarten, as I was saying, a lot of the things that we worked on with those kids, they were recognizing syllables, counting out syllables and generating rhymes. Also recognizing initial sounds and blending sounds. When you get into first grade and you're isolating and blending beginning sounds, onset with a coda in a rhyme like k, an, t, ap, or blending together 2 and 3 phoneme words and isolating and blending in 4 phoneme words, then you're really getting into a more highly developed phonological awareness skill and competency than you would expect for emergent readers and spellers. But it's continually developing, and it's so critical for reading success. So if it's so critical, then what activities promote it? Well, first of all, playing with sound. Language play, language play, language play. Doesn't necessarily have to be tied to print. All sorts of nursery rhymes, all sorts of chants. I'll talk about this later on in the semester. One of the articles I referenced in the empirical work, the empirical research, was by Bradley and Bryant. Peter Bryant was a researcher at Oxford, and I forgot her first name. Bradley was a kindergarten teacher, and she asked, I wonder if the chanting the kids are doing while they're jump roping on the kindergarten playground has anything to do with their learning how to read. And that was back in 1979. And they put their heads together and began really some of the seminal work on phonemic awareness. So the language play that goes on the playground, the language play that kids just engage in just to be funny and have a good time, is just something to really promote. Certainly reading rhyming books where the sentences focus on the final sounds, reading alphabet books with an emphasis on initial sounds. So now we're talking about alliteration. And I would argue too, as first suggested, if you recall, that the alphabetic stage originates first in spelling. It first emerges in spelling. That probably is because they don't have any choice but to put something down. They can't guess. And then makes its way into reading. So really encouraging invented spelling is a great way, I think, to promote phonemic awareness. The third component of this literacy diet is alphabet knowledge. And kids get this before they come to school: the magnetic letters on the refrigerator, the alphabet books, signs out in the community. All of these inputs help them learn the letters of the alphabet. Some kids come to school knowing the letters of the alphabet, and some do not. My daughter-in-law teaches third grade, and she has certainly had kids in her third grade classroom that do not know the letters of the alphabet. If what we're really focused on is sound symbol correspondence, remember, sound comes first, language comes first, and then print, and then reading. So if we really want kids, as we were talking about with phonemic awareness, to pay attention to the sounds, why do we even bother to teach the letter names? That's been a question. Well, a couple of reasons. One, many letter names contain the sound that they represent. So T, K, B, D. Even F and M, although it's represented at the end of the letter name rather than at the beginning. So that's a reason to teach the letter names. Another reason is that it's helpful to have a concrete label for a less concrete notion or concept, this idea of representing a sound. And so we can talk about the label, the symbol, the letter easier by talking about it given its name rather than its sound. And then, of course, there's this little problem that there's not a one-to-one correspondence between letters and the sounds they represent, as we looked at last week, the letter C. The fourth particular component is letter sound knowledge. So this is the beginning of linking together the sound and the letter that represents it. Remember, letters do not make sounds. How many times have I caught myself saying, what sound does R make? When R doesn't make any sound. These are examples from Words Their Way. So you can see it's sort of could be a picture sort. The pictures on the top row are words that begin with the sound represented by B. The second row begin with the letter that represents M, and then S, and then Ta. So there are many, many activities in Words Their Way that bring us and help us, help kids make this connection between the sounds and the graphemes that represent those sounds. And this takes a long time. And there are games for this same purpose. Getting kids to practice this, it can be difficult, and that's why it really has to be fun and fun-like. And finally, in this emergent stage, kids are learning about concepts of print and the concept of word and text. As I mentioned, that a lot of kids in kindergarten and beginning first grade and middle first grade are not able to finger point to individual words. And that's really critical. Invented writing, where they write sentences and they have to put the space between the word, helps them see that. But that's really a skill and an understanding that has to be taught. Print carries a message. Print is different from illustrations. Otherwise, we would have a pictographic writing system. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this tape, this video, that dates me, that print is speech written down, and it does not change. I suggest and encourage you to watch the assessment of students in the emergent stage. These are very short clips. And in this particular clip, you get a sense of the differences among children in the emergent stage, and it also transitions us into the letter name alphabetic stage.